Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, few figures inspire as much terror and pity as Angron, the Red Angel. Among the 20 demigod sons created by the Emperor of Mankind, Angron stands apart, not for his glory or his triumphs, but for the sheer, unrelenting brutality that defines every moment of his existence. He is a walking catastrophe, a being whose very presence turns battlefields into abattoirs and whose rage has burned across the galaxy for over 10,000 years. But to understand Angron is to understand tragedy itself, for his is a story not of chosen damnation, but of a warrior broken by forces beyond his control, peace by agonizing peace. Imagine, if you will, a figure towering over even the mightiest of space marines, his crimson skin stretched over muscles that seemed carved from living stone. Massive wings of shadow and flame spread from his back, each beat sending ripples through reality itself. His face, once noble and proud, now twisted into an eternal snarl of rage and pain. Metal cables, thick as a man's arm, snake from his skull like dreadlocks made of agony, fused so deeply into his brain that they've become part of his very being. In his hands, he wields weapons of such terrible power that they can cleave through tank armor as easily as you might tear through parchment. This is Angron as he exists now, a demon Primarch of Khorne, the blood god, an avatar of slaughter given immortal form. But it wasn't always this way. Before the wings, before the transformation into something more demon than man, before the 10 millennia of endless killing, there was simply a boy. And a child stolen from his father's laboratory and scattered across the stars by the machinations of the chaos gods. That child would land on a world that would shape him in the cruelest ways imaginable, forging not a leader of men or a beacon of hope, but an engine of destruction that even his creator, the Emperor of Mankind himself, could not control or redeem. What makes Angron unique among his brothers, the other Primarchs, is that he is perhaps the only one who never truly had a choice in his fall to chaos. Magnus the Red chose to break his father's greatest work. Horus chose to side with the ruinous powers. Fulgrim chose to embrace the demon within the blade. But Angron was pushed. He was a slave who never knew freedom, a warrior whose every victory brought him no joy, only a momentary reprieve from agony. While his transformation into a demon was not a reward sought or a gift accepted, but the final violation in a life defined by violations, the ultimate theft of the last fragments of his humanity. Among all the Primarchs, those genetically engineered demigods who were meant to unite the galaxy under their father's vision, Angron was considered one of the most physically powerful. Only Leman Russ, the Wolf King, and Vulcan, Lord of the Salamanders, could match him in sheer strength and ferocity. But where those brothers channeled their might toward purpose and strategy, Angron's power was a curse. The raw physicality that should have made him humanity's greatest champion instead became a weapon turned against all that approached him, friend and foe alike. The story of Angron is one that echoes through the Imperium's darkest secrets. It is a tale whispered in the halls of terror, buried in classified archives, expunged from official histories. The Inquisition has worked tirelessly to erase knowledge of certain events from the galaxy's memory, to ensure that ordinary citizens never learn the full horror of what transpired. But the truth, like the Red Angel himself, cannot be contained forever. It seeps out through the cracks, spreads like spilled blood, and demands to be witnessed. So settle in, as we explore the complete saga of the World Eater's Primarch. We'll journey from his earliest days on the brutal world of Nuceria, through his forced service to an emperor he grew to despise, his betrayal during the Horus Heresy, his transformation into something barely recognizable as the being he once was, and finally, to his current reign of terror in the 41st millennium. This is not a story of heroism. It is not a tale of redemption. It is the chronicle of how the brightest potential was ground down, bit by bit, until nothing remained but rage incarnate. This is the story of Angron, and it begins, like so many tragedies, with a simple accident of fate. The scattering and the chains of Nuceria. In the hidden laboratories deep beneath the Himalayan mountains of Holy Terror, the Emperor of Mankind performed his greatest work. Using forbidden science, arcane lore, and fragments of his own divine essence, he created 20 sons, each a Primarch designed to lead humanity's conquest of the stars. These were to be the Emperor's generals, his champions, beings of such power and capability that entire worlds would kneel before them. And each was crafted for a specific purpose, imbued with unique gifts and characteristics. Some would be diplomats and builders, others warriors and executioners. Together, they would forge an Imperium that would stand for eternity. But the Chaos Gods, those malevolent entities dwelling in the warp, the realm of psychic energy and nightmare, could not allow such a threat to their dominion to exist unopposed. As the infant Primarchs gestated in their acceleration pods, the 4 dark gods reached through the veil of reality and scattered them across the galaxy in what would become known as the Scattering. Each child was hurled through the immaterium, cast to distant worlds, where they would grow in circumstances vastly different from what their father had intended. Some would land on worlds of enlightenment and culture. Others would find themselves on death worlds where only the strongest survived. And one, the one who would become known as Angron, fell to Nuceria. The planet was catalogued as a civilized world, its cities gleaming with technology and culture, its ruling class refined in their manners and sophisticated in their arts. But civilization, as Angron would learn, was often merely a veneer painted over brutality. Nuceria's society was built upon the backs of slaves, and its highest entertainment came from watching those slaves tear each other apart in gladiatorial arenas. The boy Primarch crashed into the frozen mountains of Nuceria with the force of a meteor. The impact should have killed any normal child, but Primarchs were far from normal. He survived, though gravely wounded, i.e. his enhanced physiology already beginning to heal the catastrophic injuries. But he was not alone for long. According to Imperial scholars who would study the site millennia later, the area around the crash was littered with alien corpses. The bodies were those of Eldar, the ancient and mysterious race of psychically gifted warriors who had once ruled the galaxy before their civilization fell to excess and darkness. Why were the Eldar there? What had drawn them to that specific mountain at that exact moment? The answer, some theorize, lay in their prophetic abilities. The Eldar seers can peer through the skein of fate, glimpse possible futures stretching across millennia, and what they saw when they looked at this child must have filled them with such dread that they violated their own principles of non-interference. And they saw the oceans of blood he would spill, the billions who would die by his hand and at his command. They saw a future where his rage would tear apart worlds and shake the foundations of reality itself. So they attempted to kill him, there in those mountains, before he could grow into the monster their visions foretold. They failed. Even as a child, even wounded and alone, the Primarch's gene-crafted physiology gave him strength and speed beyond mortal understanding. He fought them with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, using nothing but his bare hands and perhaps a rock or broken blade scavenged from the frozen ground. When the battle was over, the Eldar warriors lay dead, and the child was alone once more, bleeding in the snow. That's where the slavers found him. Representatives of Nuceria's ruling caste, the High Riders, who governed the planet from their palatial estates and amused themselves with blood sports. They saw not a person, not even a remarkable child who had somehow survived both a fall from the sky and a battle with Xenos warriors. They saw property. They saw potential profit. They saw a gladiator who could make them wealthy beyond measure. The child was taken to Deshea, Nuceria's capital city, a place of soaring spires and ancient colosseums, where the wealthy gathered to watch slaves kill each other for sport and glory. But first, there was a problem that needed solving. The boy, despite his youth, showed remarkable reluctance to kill. He fought when pressed, certainly, his survival instincts and genetic programming ensuring he would not simply lie down and die. But there was no joy in it, no enthusiasm. Yet the High Riders needed their property to be properly motivated, to embrace violence not as a regrettable necessity, but as a calling. They had a solution that would define everything that came after, a solution that would echo across the millennia and shape the fate of billions. They would perform psychosurgery, an invasive procedure that involved hammering a complex network of archaeotech implants directly into the child's brain. These implants, which would become known to history as the butcher's nails, would ensure that their new gladiator would fight with the proper enthusiasm. The surgery was brutal beyond description. Picture, if you can, thick metal cables being driven through skull bone and into the soft tissue of the brain itself. These weren't simple electrodes or monitoring devices. They were sophisticated archaeotech, technology so advanced that its origins had been lost to time, repurposed by Nuceria's elite for the basest of purposes. The cables, each one trailing through the victim's skull like mechanical dreadlocks, penetrated deep into the brain's structure, wrapping around neural pathways, replacing organic tissue with cold metal. The young Primarch screamed, they say, as the nails were hammered home. He screamed until his voice failed, until the procedure was complete, until the person he might have become was murdered by crude brain surgery and replaced with something else entirely. When he finally stopped screaming, when he opened his eyes again, the world had changed. Colors seemed sharper, sounds more intense, but emotions, the subtle shadings of feeling that make us human, they had dulled. Everything except one. Rage burned through him like white-hot fire, and only in violence, only in the act of killing, did the pain recede, and something resembling pleasure flood his altered brain. They named him, though the records are unclear on what that original name might have been. Some sources suggest Angronius, others simply refer to him by various titles earned in the pits. Regardless of the name, the being was now a weapon, his purpose defined by his owners, his very brain chemistry hijacked to serve their entertainment. The gladiatorial arenas of Deschea were vast amphitheaters where tens of thousands gathered to watch men and women fight and die. The combatants were slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, anyone the High Riders deemed expendable. They fought with various weapons, swords and axes, nets and tridents, even bare hands when the crowd demanded particularly brutal spectacles. Most lived only a few fights before meeting their inevitable end on the blood-stained sands. But the Primarch was different. Despite being just a child, his genetically enhanced body grew rapidly, his muscles developing with supernatural speed, his reflexes and strength far exceeding even the most skilled gladiator. The butcher's nails, rather than hindering his performance, drove him to heights of savagery that made the crowd roar with approval. He became undefeatable, a fan favorite, the champion whose fights drew the largest crowds and the highest wages. Yet something remarkable happened in those pits, something the High Riders had not anticipated. Despite the nails, despite the conditioning, despite everything that had been done to him, the boy, who would be Angron, began to form bonds with his fellow gladiators. These slaves, these condemned prisoners, they became something he had never had before. They became his family, his brothers and sisters in chains. Together they suffered. Together they fought. Together they died. And from their shared agony, a fierce loyalty was born. There was Oenomaus, an older gladiator who became something of a mentor to the young champion. A warrior who had survived countless battles and bore the scars to prove it. He taught the Primarch more than just fighting techniques. He taught him about brotherhood, about loyalty, about how even in the depths of slavery, one could maintain dignity and honor. When Oenomaus finally fell in the arena, struck down by multiple opponents in a fight designed to be unwinnable. Yet something inside the Primarch broke even further. The nails demanded rage, and rage he gave them, but now it had direction. Now it had purpose beyond simple violence. Now it had a target. The High Riders, who had stolen his life, stolen his mind, stolen his brothers and sisters, and thrown their lives away for entertainment. The Primarch began to plan. He organized his fellow gladiators in secret, whispering between matches, building trust and camaraderie among the slaves. Several times he attempted to lead revolts, and several times these uprisings were crushed, the participants punished with tortures that would have broken lesser beings. But each failure taught him something new about strategy, about leadership, about what it took to truly organize an army of the desperate and the damned. Then came the grandest games ever held on Nuceria. But the High Riders, in their arrogance and their hunger for ever greater spectacles, announced death matches that would involve every gladiator in Dashir. Thousands of slaves would fight in a battle royale, a massive melee where only the strongest would survive. It was meant to be the ultimate entertainment. Instead, it became the moment the Primarch had been waiting for. As the battle began, as the crowd settled in to watch thousands of slaves slaughter each other, the gladiators turned as one. They had been armed for the spectacle, given real weapons to make the show more exciting. Now those weapons found new targets. The guards, the overseers, the handlers who kept them chained and beaten, all fell before the sudden uprising. The crowd's cheers turned to screams of terror as the gladiators fought their way out of the arena, on stealing weapons and armor, setting fires, turning the streets of Deshea into a battlefield. Nearly 2,000 slaves escaped that day, fleeing into the northern mountains, where the Primarch had first crashed so many years before. They called themselves the Eaters of Cities, a name earned through their absolute refusal to show mercy to those who had enslaved them. They were an army now, bound together by shared suffering, and led by a warrior whose tactical genius was beginning to emerge despite the rage that clouded his mind. For years they raided from the mountains. Every army sent against them was defeated, its soldiers killed or convinced to join the rebellion. The High Riders, humiliated and enraged, threw more and more resources at the problem. But the Primarch was learning, adapting, his genetically encoded military genius beginning to shine through even the fog of the butcher's nails. He led his army in lightning raids, choosing battlefields carefully, using the terrain to advantage, turning every engagement into a massacre of Nucerian forces. But it couldn't last. The mountains provided poor shelter and little food. Each battle, each victory, came at a cost. Slowly, through attrition and starvation, and the simple exhaustion of constant warfare, the Eaters of Cities were ground down. From nearly 2,000, their numbers dwindled to 1,000, then to a few hundred, until finally, only a small band of the most loyal and most skilled remained. The end came at Deshilika Ridge, a bleak spit of land atop a mountain called Fedan Moor. There, the last of the Eaters of Cities found themselves surrounded. And 7 armies had been dispatched by the High Riders, professional military forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands, equipped with the best weapons Nuceria could produce. There would be no escape, no last-minute reprieve, no miracle to save them. The Primarch knew this. His warriors knew this. They prepared to die on their feet, weapons in hand, making the slavers pay for every life in blood. In those final hours, as the armies closed in and death seemed certain, the Primarch did something that showed just how much humanity remained despite the nails. He fed his trusted comrades his own blood. Primarch blood is no ordinary fluid. It carries within it a fraction of the Emperor's own genetic essence, concentrated vitality that can sustain life even when all hope seems lost. He gave this freely to his brothers and sisters, trying to keep them alive for just a little longer, to give them strength for the final battle. The dawn came. The armies began to move. The Eaters of Cities raised their weapons, ready to make their last stand. And then the sky tore open. The Emperor's betrayal. Massive golden ships materialized in Nuceria's orbit, vessels of such size and power that they made the planet's own defense fleet look like children's toys. These were the warships of the Imperium of Man, and aboard the flagship was the Emperor himself, master of mankind, lord of terror, creator of the Primarchs. He had been searching for his scattered sons for decades, and now, drawn by the psychic beacon that all Primarchs unconsciously emit, he had found another of his lost children. But what he found was not what he had hoped for. From orbit, the Emperor had observed his son for months, watching the gladiator's struggles, his leadership, his tactical brilliance. The Emperor had felt pride as he watched this Primarch lead his army against overwhelming odds, victory after victory. Here was a son who could unite disparate forces, who could inspire loyalty in the face of death, who could outthink and outfight opponents vastly more numerous. Here was a son who, properly guided, could become one of the Imperium's greatest assets. What the Emperor had not fully anticipated was the depth of the bond between this Primarch and his fellow slaves. What he had not understood was that for the first time in his existence, the being who would become Angron had found something worth more than life itself: brotherhood, belonging, a cause he had chosen rather than had forced upon him. The Emperor, surrounded by his golden custodian guard, teleported directly to Deshalika Ridge. He appeared before his son in a flash of light and psychic power, a being of such presence and majesty that ordinary humans would fall to their knees in worship. The Primarch, wounded and exhausted, his followers arrayed around him and ready to die, looked upon his father for the first time. The Emperor's offer was simple and, from his perspective, generous beyond measure. He offered his son a legion, 20,000 space marines created from the Primarch's own genetic template, warriors who would follow him across the stars. He offered power, authority, a place at the right hand of the master of mankind himself. He offered lifetimes of conquest, the chance to unite the galaxy under one banner, as to bring order to a cosmos drowning in chaos and darkness. All the Primarch had to do was accept his destiny, take his place among his brothers, and come home to Terra. The Primarch, bleeding and in pain, the nails screaming in his skull, looked at the Emperor. He looked at his fellow gladiators, the men and women who had fought beside him, who had become his true family. He looked at the 7 armies surrounding them, ready to slaughter everyone he had come to love. And then, in what would become one of the most significant moments in the history of the Imperium, he did something no other Primarch had ever done. He refused. He chose to stay. He chose to die with his brothers and sisters rather than abandon them to save himself. The Emperor, for all his power and vision, or for all his understanding of humanity and ability to peer through time itself, did not understand this choice. Or perhaps he understood, but simply did not care. He had spent too long building his Imperium, gathering his tools, preparing for the great crusade that would unite mankind. He had invested too much in creating the Primarchs to lose one to something as mundane as slavery on a backwater world. So he made a decision that would reverberate across 10,000 years of history. Without another word, without giving the Primarch any choice in the matter, the Emperor teleported him away. One moment, the warrior stood among his family, ready to make his last stand. The next moment he was gone, snatched away by teleportarium beam and deposited aboard the Emperor's flagship, alone and separated from everything he had fought for. Behind him, there on Deshalika Ridge, the Eaters of Cities stood in shock as the armies closed in. Without their leader, without their champion, they had no chance. They were slaughtered to the last man and woman, cut down by Nucerian forces, while their general was forced to watch from orbit, powerless to help, unable even to die alongside them. For the Primarch, this was not salvation. It was the ultimate betrayal. Every other Primarch, when reunited with their father, had been welcomed as heroes. Horus had been celebrated on Thonia. Fulgrim had been greeted with joy on Chemos. Even Mortarion, whose homeworld was a toxic hellscape, had been allowed to complete his mission of slaying the tyrant who ruled his people before ascending to lead his legion. But this Primarch, he was stolen away, forced to abandon his family, forced to live while those he loved died without him. The Emperor had saved his life and, in doing so, had destroyed everything that made that life worth living. The warrior arrived on the flagship, broken in ways that even the butcher's nails could not account for. He was given medical treatment by the Emperor's personal physicians, his wounds healed by technology and science beyond anything Nuceria possessed. He was presented to his legion, the Warhounds, 20,000 space marines who had been waiting decades for their gene-sire to be found. They welcomed him with celebration, these warriors who bore his genetic code in their very cells, who had been created to serve him. But their Primarch could give them nothing. The nails demanded violence, yes, but more than that, he was consumed by grief and rage. Oh, the first Warhounds who approached their new commander were met not with words or leadership, but with savage brutality. The Primarch killed them, tearing them apart with his bare hands, unable or unwilling to control the fury that consumed him. For some time, approaching the gene-sire meant certain death. Officers vanished from the records, killed before they could even speak. Among those who disappeared was Ibram Greer, the Legion Master who had commanded the Warhounds for 30 years, a respected leader whose removal was never explained or acknowledged. It was only Captain Khan of the 8th Assault Company who finally managed to reach the Primarch without being immediately slain. Khan, who would himself become a legend in the millennia to come, somehow saw through the rage to the person buried beneath. He spoke to his gene-father not as a subordinate to commander, but as one warrior to another. Slowly, gradually, something like communication was established. The Primarch would never heal, never truly recover from what had been done to him. But he could at least function enough to lead his legion. The warrior was given a new name, Angron, which in the language of Nuceria meant something close to Lord of the Red Sands. It was not the name he had been born with, not the name his father, the Emperor, had originally given him, but it was the name that would echo through history. Angron, the Red Angel, the Betrayer, the Broken One. He renamed his legion as well. The Warhounds, a title that spoke of discipline and control, would become the World Eaters. This name honored the gladiators who had called themselves the Eaters of Cities, as the brothers and sisters who had died while their leader was stolen away. Captain Draga of the 9th Company had promised Angron that under his leadership the Legion would become Eaters of Worlds, and so they would. But the most significant change, the one that would define the Legion for all time, was Angron's insistence on installing the Butcher's nails into his Space Marines. If he was forced to live with this agony, if the nails would forever deny him peace, then his sons would share in his suffering. At first, the Emperor forbade it. The surgeries were dangerous beyond measure, the technology barely understood, but Angron would not be swayed. If his legion would not bear the nails, he would not lead them. The first attempts at replicating the Nucerian implants were catastrophic. Every single Marine who underwent the procedure died, their enhanced physiology unable to cope with the crude invasive surgery. But Angron persisted. Eventually, using reverse-engineered technology from another world called Genna, the apothecaries perfected a version of the nails that could be installed with an acceptably low fatality rate. Khan was the first World Eater to survive the procedure, and after him, thousands more followed. These mass-produced nails were different from the originals that had been hammered into Angron's skull. They took the form of thinner cables, rather than the thick, dreadlock-like implants the Primarch bore. More importantly, they lacked the degenerative effects of the Archaeotech originals. The Space Marines would experience the same amplified rage, at the same reduction of all sensation except anger and battle lust. But their brains would not slowly disintegrate the way Angron's was. They would suffer, but they would not die from it. As the World Eaters spread across the galaxy during the Great Crusade, they developed a reputation for absolute brutality. Where other legions would accept surrender, the World Eaters would continue killing until every enemy was dead. Where other Primarchs would negotiate compliance or show mercy to defeated foes, Angron would order the wholesale slaughter of entire populations. Surrender meant nothing to warriors with the nails, for they could only find relief from pain through violence, and so violence they would deliver without end. Angron established a tradition within his legion, a practice taken from his Nucerian upbringing, decimation. Or when the World Eaters failed to conquer a world within 31 hours, the length of a single Nucerian day, the time in which Angron had once scored his greatest victories in the gladiatorial arenas, they would be punished. 1 in every 10 Space Marines would be selected at random and killed by his 9 brothers. This brutal practice, forcing warriors to execute their own comrades, was meant to instill discipline and urgency. Instead, it merely spread the trauma and rage that defined their Primarch. The Emperor watched this development with growing concern. He had hoped that time and leadership would temper his son's anger, that purpose and duty would overcome the damage done on Nuceria. Instead, Angron seemed to be getting worse, not better, spreading his suffering to his entire legion. The master of mankind had rescued his son from death, given him everything a Primarch could want, but in return had created not a general, but a butcher, not a leader, but a destroyer. The question became not whether to act, but when and how. The Night of the Wolf. The world of Genna was meant to be a simple compliance action, another planet brought into the fold of the Imperium through force of arms. The World Eaters descended upon the population with their usual enthusiasm, the butcher's nails driving them to heights of violence that shocked even hardened Imperial forces. But this time, something snapped. Perhaps it was the nails degrading further in Angron's brain. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated weight of decades of rage and grief. Whatever the cause, the World Eaters went beyond even their usual brutality. They didn't just conquer Genna, they massacred it. Every man, woman, and child on the planet was put to the sword, their bodies piled high in pyramids of flesh and bone. Cities were burned, their populations slaughtered wholesale, whether they resisted or surrendered. The World Eaters, lost in a red haze of violence, killed until there was nothing left to kill, transforming an imperial compliance into what could only be called genocide. The Emperor, when he learned of this atrocity, could no longer ignore the problem. He dispatched Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, to Genna with explicit orders. Russ was to confront Angron, to make him cease the wholesale massacre of human populations, and to end the practice of installing the butcher's nails in World Eater Space Marines. The Emperor himself had decreed it, and Leman Russ, and ever loyal to his father, would see the command carried out. Leman Russ arrived at Genna at the head of his Space Wolves Legion, his warriors arrayed in full battle formation. The 2 legions met on the fields beyond the dead city of Malkoya, the World Eaters battered and bleeding from their campaign, the Space Wolves fresh and ready for whatever might come. The Primarchs stood before their respective forces, a study in contrasts. Angron was awash in blood, carved up by fresh wounds that his enhanced physiology had not yet fully healed. He carried Widowmaker, his first chain axe, a brutal weapon that had drunk deep of countless enemies. His armor was the red of drying blood, decorated with chains that bore the skulls of his fallen gladiator brothers from Nuceria. Even standing still, rage seemed to radiate from him like heat from a forge. Leman Russ, by contrast, wore resplendent battle plate the color of storms on his homeworld of Fenris. His armor was pristine, his bearing regal, despite his savage origins. He carried Krakenmore, an immense chainsword toothed with fragments harvested from some Fenrisian sea beast. Where Angron embodied barely restrained violence, Russ projected controlled power, a warrior who chose when and where to unleash his fury. Russ delivered the Emperor's message. The implantation surgeries must end, the massacres must stop. The World Eaters had gone too far, and now they would be brought to heel, by force if necessary. Angron, the nails screaming in his skull, the pain of his existence driving him toward violence with every passing second, refused to acknowledge his brother's authority. Yet he warned Russ to depart before the situation became something to regret. But Russ, confident in his mission and secure in his belief that he fought for the Emperor's will, would not be cowed. He informed Angron that the commands came from their father himself, that this was not a suggestion, but an order. Surely Angron would see reason. Surely he would understand that the Emperor's word was law. Angron's response was to question whether the Emperor had truly sent Russ at all. After everything that had been done to him, after being stolen from his final stand, after watching his brothers and sisters die while he was powerless to help, why should he trust anything the Emperor said or did? More than that, Angron did something shocking. He openly insulted the Emperor, calling him a slave driver, a tyrant, no better than the High Riders of New Syria.
You know, I have to pause here for a moment because this part of Angron's story genuinely bothers me every time I revisit it. I've been covering Warhammer lore for years now, and out of all the Primarchs, all the tragedies in this setting, Angron's teleportation from the Shelika Ridge hits different. The Emperor could have deployed the Custodians, he could have sent the Warhounds to fight alongside the slaves. He had options, but he chose the easy route, and in doing so, he created the very monster he was trying to prevent. It's frustrating because this moment changed everything. Sometimes I wonder if the entire horse heresy could have been avoided if the Emperor had just shown a shred of compassion that day. But anyway, let's continue with what happens next.
He even joked, with grim humor, that perhaps he should take the imperial throne for himself. See how the master of mankind liked being forced to serve another's will. For Leman Russ, raised in the Emperor's service and utterly devoted to his father, these words were heresy of the highest order. Before either Primarch could give a command, before anyone could de-escalate the situation, the first shot was fired. To this day, no one knows whether it came from the World Eater's lines or the Space Wolves. Both legions would later claim the other side had started it. But it didn't matter who fired first. What mattered was that two full Space Marine legions, tens of thousands of warriors on each side, suddenly found themselves in battle with each other. The engagement would become known as the Night of the Wolf, though Imperial archives would sanitize it as the Genna Scouring, omitting the moment when Brotherhood turned to bloodshed. The two Primarchs clashed in the center of the battlefield, their weapons meeting with such force that the air itself seemed to crack. Angron, driven by the nails, fought with abandon, every strike meant to kill, every movement committed fully. Leman Russ, more measured in his approach, fought with skill and strategy, trying to outmaneuver his rage-blinded brother. The duel was magnificent and terrible. Angron shattered Russ's sword Krakenmar, the ancient frost blade breaking beneath the Primarch's savage assault. Leman Russ, in turn, destroyed Widowmaker, the chain axe that had been Angron's companion since his earliest days leading the World Eaters. Both Primarchs bled. Both sustained grievous wounds that would have killed any normal warrior 10 times over. They fought with the full measure of their transhuman abilities, each blow struck with enough force to crack ceramite armor, each movement faster than human eyes could follow. Around them, the two legions battled with equal ferocity. World Eaters, lost in the haze of the Butcher's nails, threw themselves at the Space Wolves with utter disregard for their own lives. They sought only to kill, to feel that moment of release from pain that came with ending another's existence. The Space Wolves, disciplined but savage in their own way, met them blow for blow, forming defensive formations and concentrating their fire to overwhelm isolated World Eaters. And then, as Angron pressed his advantage over his wounded brother, and as he stood over the barely conscious form of Leman Russ, ready to deliver the killing blow, the Wolf King revealed his true strategy. While the two Primarchs had dueled, while Angron had focused entirely on the enemy before him, Russ's warriors had been maneuvering. The Space Wolves had not fought to win the broader battle. They had fought to surround their target. Now, as Angron looked around, savoring what he believed was his victory, he realized he was surrounded by hundreds of Space Wolves. all with their weapons trained on him. One word from Russ, even barely conscious, and they would open fire. Leman Russ, bleeding and beaten, but still capable of speech, explained what he had been trying to teach his brother all along. This is what victory looks like, Angron. Not in gladiator pits, not in simple butchery, but in warfare. Your legion is scattered across the battlefield, each warrior fighting alone or in small packs. Mine are organized, controlled, acting as one. I could have had you killed at any moment. I held back, deliberately, to make you see. Warriors who care about surviving, who fight not just for the pleasure of killing, but for a purpose beyond themselves. Those are the warriors who win wars. But Angron, even surrounded, even facing certain death, could not grasp the lesson. The nails would not let him. He looked at the broader battlefield, at the casualties on both sides, and saw that the World Eaters had inflicted more losses on the Space Wolves than they had sustained themselves. To him, this was victory. The mathematics of slaughter favored his legion, therefore they had won. The fact that he himself was surrounded, as that his scattered warriors could be destroyed piece by the coordinated Space Wolves, meant nothing to him. Your men are losing, Leman, Angron said, his voice thick with certainty. They're losing because they care. Mine fight for pleasure, knowing any life outside of war is denied to them. Their own lives are as meaningless to themselves as they are to me, and that is the gift given by the butcher's nails. Warriors, not soldiers. Warriors with no fear of death and no caution to guard against it. Leman Russ, understanding that his brother was lost to reason, that the nails had damaged him beyond any hope of recovery, howled. It was a sound that carried across the battlefield, the call to retreat recognized by every space wolf. His legion disengaged, pulling back in coordinated order, leaving the World Eaters bloodied but convinced of their victory. For Angron, this confirmed everything he believed. He had defeated a brother Primarch in single combat. His legion had inflicted heavier casualties than they'd sustained, and the Space Wolves had retreated. To him, it was absolute victory. But to others, including Lorgar of the Wordbearers, who would later hear the tale, it was an embarrassment. It showed Angron's recklessness, his lack of discipline, his inability to think beyond the immediate violence. The Night of the Wolf had revealed the World Eaters' greatest weakness. They could win battles through sheer ferocity, but they could never win wars, for war required more than just rage. The incident changed nothing. Angron did not return to Terra to answer for Genna's massacre. The Butcher's nails continued to be implanted in World Eater space marines until nearly every warrior in the Legion bore them. The massacres continued. If anything, Angron became even more brutal, even less controlled. And somewhere, in the dark places between the stars, forces that had watched the Primarchs since their creation began to smile. The seeds of the Horus heresy had not yet been planted, but the soil was being prepared. Angron's rage, his hatred of the Emperor, his absolute lack of connection to anything but violence, would make him the perfect tool when the time came to tear the Imperium apart. The Horus heresy, the Shadow Crusade, begins. The galaxy was changing, though few could see it yet. Horus Lupercal, first among the Primarchs and Warmaster of the Imperium, had begun his long-planned rebellion against the Emperor. Through careful manipulation and strategic positioning, he had won over several of his brothers to the cause of chaos. Magnus the Red, brought low by his own hubris. Mortarion, convinced that the Emperor had betrayed everything they fought for. Fulgrim, possessed by a demon and lost to the pleasures of excess. And others, each for their own reasons, each carrying their own grievances against their father. For Angron, joining the rebellion required almost no convincing at all. Horus, master manipulator that he was, barely had to plant seeds of doubt in his brother's mind. Those seeds had been growing for decades, watered by every order from Terra, every campaign commanded by the Emperor, every moment that Angron was forced to serve the man who had stolen him from his final stand at Deshalika Ridge. When Horus came to Angron and spoke of overthrowing the Emperor, of replacing him with a stronger ruler, one who understood what it meant to be a warrior, Angron's only question was when they would begin. the Horus heresy erupted across the galaxy with the Dropsite massacre at Istvan V, where loyalist legions were betrayed and slaughtered by those they thought were brothers. The World Eaters participated with their characteristic enthusiasm, though notably, Angron had initially sabotaged an earlier operation at Istvan III. Horus had planned a clean orbital bombardment to destroy the loyalist elements of the traitor legions, but Angron, unable to resist the call of the Nails, had descended to the surface with his warriors to engage in close combat, turning a strategic strike into a prolonged slaughter. But it was after Istvan, and during what would become known as the Shadow Crusade, that Angron would reach his darkest hour. Lorgar, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, had proposed a joint campaign against the Ultramarines, the largest and most powerful of the Loyalist legions. The Word-Bearers had a particular hatred for Robut Guilliman and his 13th Legion, stemming from an incident decades earlier when the Emperor had forced the Word-Bearers to kneel in disgrace before the Ultramarines for their failure to enforce the Imperial truth. Now, with the heresy begun, Lorgar sought vengeance. Lorgar and Angron made for strange allies. The Word-Bearer was a scholar, a philosopher, a seeker of spiritual truth, who had turned his devotion from the Emperor to the Chaos Gods. Angron was pure violence, a being who cared nothing for faith or theology, who sought only the brief respite from pain that came with killing. Yet they worked together, the Word-Bearers providing strategic direction, while the World Eaters provided overwhelming brutality. The Shadow Crusade began with the Battle of Calth, where the Word-Bearers launched a devastating surprise attack on the Ultramarines' primary mustering world. The battle was a masterpiece of treachery, with trusted advisors revealing themselves as traitors, orbital bombardments targeting command centers, and Word-Bearer forces striking with perfect coordination. The Ultramarines' Legion was badly mauled, though not destroyed, and the survivors found themselves fighting a desperate battle beneath the surface of Calth, as the planet's environment was rendered uninhabitable. With the Ultramarines reeling, as Lorgar and Angron turned their attention to Ultramar itself, the 500 worlds that Robut Guilliman had built into a model of imperial efficiency and culture. World after world fell to the combined assault of the World Eaters and Word-Bearers, each conquest marked by wholesale slaughter and dark rituals. Lorgar was building towards something, conducting ceremonies that drew power from the warp, but Angron cared little for his brother's mysticism. He cared only that there were always new enemies to kill, new battles to fight, new moments of relief from the agony in his skull. During the Shadow Crusade, those close to Angron began to notice changes. The Butcher's nails, never truly stable, were degrading faster than anyone had anticipated. They had been designed for baseline humans, not for the unique physiology of a Primarch. Angron's brain was constantly trying to heal the damage the nails caused, but this only made things worse. The implants bit deeper, destroying more neural tissue, and his healing factor would attempt to regenerate what was lost, creating a vicious cycle that was slowly killing him. His temperament, never stable, became even more erratic. His rages grew more intense, his moments of lucidity fewer and farther between. Lorgar watched his brother's deterioration with growing alarm. He alone among the traitor Primarchs seemed to genuinely care about Angron's fate, not as a weapon to be used, but as a brother to be saved. The Word-Bearer began searching for a way to halt the nail's progression, to give Angron some relief from his suffering. The answer, Lorgar believed, lay not in technology or medicine, but in the power of the warp itself. If Angron could be transformed, elevated, remade into something more than merely mortal, then perhaps he could transcend the limitations of his damaged brain. The opportunity came when Lorgar proposed that they journey to Nuceria itself, the world where Angron had been enslaved, where the Eaters of Cities had made their last stand, where everything had gone wrong. Angron agreed instantly. He had unfinished business with his homeworld, accounts to settle with the High Riders who had stolen his life. Together, the two legions descended upon Nuceria with holy fury, and Angron walked once more upon the sands, where he had bled as a slave. The campaign was brutal, even by the standards of the heresy. The World Eaters and Word-Bearers did not simply conquer Nuceria, they exterminated it. Every High Rider was hunted down and killed, their palatial estates burned, their artifacts destroyed. The gladiatorial arenas where Angron had fought were torn down stone by stone. The cities where he had been paraded as property were reduced to rubble. The population, complicit in his enslavement through their entertainment, were shown no mercy. Planet-wide, the killing continued, a genocide carried out with methodical thoroughness. But Nuceria's defenders had called for help. Robute Guilliman, gathering what remained of his scattered legion after Calth, arrived in system with a significant Ultramarines force. He was determined to exact vengeance on the traitors and to save what remained of Nuceria. The stage was set for a confrontation between three Primarchs, and Lorgar's dark plan was reaching its culmination. The battle that followed was apocalyptic. Ultramarines in their blue and gold armor clashed with Word-Bearers in their red and bone, while World Eaters in their white and blue carved through both sides with equal enthusiasm. Titans walked the battlefield, god machines of incredible power exchanging fire that could level cities. At one point, Angron found himself beneath a Warhound Titan's massive foot, as it prepared to stomp down and crush even a Primarch. He caught the foot with his bare hands, his strength matching the war machine's, holding it aloft long enough for his warriors to bring it down with concentrated fire. Then Guilliman and Angron met on the field of battle, the avenging sun against the Red Angel, the master strategist against the Berserker. They dueled amid the carnage, and despite Guilliman's tactical genius and superior equipment, Angron's sheer rage and physical power won out. He battered the Ultramarine Primarch down, landing blow after blow, breaking through his defenses through overwhelming aggression. As Guilliman lay wounded, Angron stood over him ready to deliver the killing blow. But Guilliman, in his desperation, struck out and crushed something that Angron wore even to this day, one of the skulls of his fallen gladiator brothers, hanging from a chain across his breastplate. The skull, preserved through centuries of warfare, shattered under the Ultramarine's boot. This small act of destruction hit Angron harder than any weapon could have. These skulls were all he had left of his true family, the brothers and sisters who had died while he was stolen away. And now, even these memories, these relics, were being destroyed. Angron threw himself at Guilliman with a howl that seemed to defy mortal origins, a sound of pure anguish and rage that rippled through the warp itself. And Lorgar, watching from nearby, saw his moment. As Angron's agony reached its peak, as his brother's suffering became a beacon that shone across dimensions, Lorgar began to chant. The words were not of any human language. They had never been spoken by any living being in the material universe. They were the tongue of demons, of entities that existed beyond time and space, and they carried power that could reshape reality. Lorgar channeled the essence of Khorne, the blood god, the chaos entity who embodied all rage and violence and martial glory in the universe. He called upon the might of the warp, fed by the deaths of billions across the galaxy, amplified by the ritual massacres the Word-Bearers had conducted throughout the Shadow Crusade. The sky above Nuceria tore open, and the ruin storm descended. A crimson torrent formed from the ghosts of 100 murdered worlds, raining blood upon the battlefield. This was Lorgar's gift to his brother, his attempt to save Angron from the death that the nails would inevitably bring. He was giving him immortality, transformation, a new existence beyond the limitations of flesh. Whether Angron wanted this gift or not was irrelevant. Lorgar had made his decision. Ascension to demonhood. The transformation was agony beyond description. Angron's body began to change, his flesh burning away and reforming, his bones breaking and reknitting stronger, his very essence being rewritten by the power of the warp. The butcher's nails, those metal cables that had tormented him for over a century, fused with his skull, becoming part of his new form, rather than foreign objects, hammered into meat and bone. His muscles swelled, becoming slabs of crimson flesh harder than stone. His skin turned the color of arterial blood, marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe of their own accord. Wings erupted from his back, massive pinions of shadow and flame that blotted out the sky above. His face, once capable of expressions despite the rage that consumed it, twisted into a permanent snarl of fury and hunger. Horns grew from his skull, curving back like a crown of blasphemy. His teeth became fangs, each one a dagger capable of tearing through ceramite. His hands grew into talons that could rend tank armor. Everything human, everything that had once been the gladiator from Nuceria, was burned away in the fires of transformation. But there were witnesses who tried to prevent this damnation. 19 librarians of the World Eaters, psychic warriors who still retained some connection to their Primarch's original purpose, formed a gestalt entity. They reached into the warp, trying to pull Angron's soul back from the abyss, fighting against Lorgar and the demons who pulled from the other side. It was a tug of war with a Primarch's very essence as the prize, and the librarians, despite their power, were vastly outmatched. Lorgar, a more powerful psyker than all 19 combined, overwhelmed their resistance. The ritual completed, the transformation finished, and something new stepped forth onto Nuceria's dying surface. This was no longer Angron the Primarch. This was Angron, the demon prince of Khorne, a being that was as much warp entity as it was physical matter, an avatar of the blood god's rage made manifest. The newly ascended Angron's first act was to slaughter the librarians who had tried to save him. They had failed in their attempt, and now they paid the price for their interference. He tore through them with savage efficiency, his new form granting him power beyond anything he had possessed before. The 19 librarians were annihilated, their gene seed lost, their sacrifice ultimately meaningless. The World Eaters who witnessed their Primarch's transformation were left in a state of shock. Some saw it as a glorious ascension, their gene father elevated to godhood. Others recognized it for what it was, the final destruction of whatever remained of the man they had followed, replaced by something that wore his form but was fundamentally alien. The Legion would never forgive the word-bearers for this, a hatred that would endure for 10,000 years. Angron had become, in Lorgar's estimation, saved. He was no longer dying by degrees from the nail's degradation. He was immortal now, a demon prince who could not truly die in any conventional sense. But he was also no longer capable of choice. As a mortal Primarch, Angron had at least possessed free will, the ability to make decisions even if those decisions were heavily influenced by the nails. Now, he was bound to Khorne utterly and completely. He had gone from being a slave to the Nucerians, to being a slave to the Emperor, to being a slave to the Blood God. He had never been free, and now he never would be. The ascension came with other costs as well. As a demon prince, Angron's connection to the material universe became tenuous. He required constant bloodshed to maintain his presence in real space. Without planetary-scale slaughter to anchor him, he would be pulled back into the warp within weeks. This meant that the World Eaters, already known for their brutality, were now forced to be even more violent. Any populated system they encountered had to be attacked, its population massacred, simply to keep their Primarch with them. During the remainder of the heresy, as the traitor forces marched on Terra itself, Angron led from the front with the might of his new form. He was larger than any dreadnought, stronger than a battle tank, capable of tearing apart fortifications with his bare hands. His weapons, the massive axe Spinegrinder and the cursed sword Samniarius, are carved through loyalist space marines as easily as a scythe through wheat. Where he walked, reality itself seemed to thin, the barrier between the warp and the materium weakening in his presence. But there was something deeply tragic about this new Angron. Before his ascension, there had at least been moments of lucidity, brief windows where something of the person remained visible through the rage. Now there was only violence, only hunger, only the endless need to kill. The memories of Nuceria, of the eaters of cities, of standing with brothers and sisters in chains. all of it was subsumed beneath the demon's nature. He still wore the skulls of his fallen gladiators, still carried reminders of his past, but they meant nothing to him now. They were just decoration on a monster that no longer truly understood why it wore them. The transformation affected his relationship with his legion as well. The World Eaters had always struggled with discipline, but now their Primarch was barely capable of strategic thought at all. He would charge into battle without concern for tactics or positioning, trusting in his immortality and his strength. His warriors, driven by the nails and by loyalty to their gene father, would follow him into any situation, no matter how suicidal. The result was that the World Eaters became even more of a blunt instrument, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage, but unable to coordinate with other forces or maintain any kind of sustained campaign. Lorgar would later insist that he had saved his brother, that transformation into a demon prince was the only way to free Angron from the death sentence the nails represented. And in a strictly technical sense, he was correct. The butcher's nails were no longer killing Angron because Angron was no longer truly mortal in any meaningful sense. But what had been saved? The man who had led gladiators to freedom was gone. The warrior who had refused to abandon his brothers and sisters was no more. What remained was a weapon, a tool of the dark gods, a creature that existed solely to spill blood for Horn's glory. If this was salvation, it was a salvation that looked remarkably like damnation. The World Eaters themselves were divided on the subject. Some embraced their Primarch's new form, seeing it as the ultimate expression of what the Legion had always been, pure violence unrestrained by weakness or mortality. Others, those who still remembered what Angron had been, what he might have become if circumstances had been different, saw only tragedy. But divided or not, they followed, because they were World Eaters, and following their Primarch into hell itself was what they were made to do. As the heresy ground toward its bloody conclusion, Angron would participate in some of the most savage fighting the galaxy had ever seen. He would stand at the Eternity Wall during the Siege of Terra, battling against some of the Imperium's greatest champions. He would rage through the corridors of the Imperial Palace itself, bringing slaughter to the very heart of the Emperor's domain. But no matter how many he killed, no matter how much blood was spilled, it was never enough. The hunger that Khorne had instilled in him could never be satisfied, the rage never quenched. He was a prisoner in his own flesh, bound by chains made of demons and warp stuff, forced to kill forever without purpose or meaning. 10,000 years of rage. When the heresy ended, with Horus's defeat and the traitor Legion's flight to the Eye of Terror, Angron retreated with the remnants of his World Eaters. The Eye of Terror, that massive wound in reality where the warp and materium overlapped, became his prison and his kingdom. Within that nightmare realm, where the laws of physics were suggestions and time flowed in impossible directions, Angron and his legion made their home. But home is perhaps the wrong word. The Eye was more like a cage, a place from which they could launch raids but never truly escape. The 10,000 years that followed were not kind to the World Eaters. On the frozen world of Scalathrax, the Legion finally tore itself apart. Khan, yet the same warrior who had first reached out to Angron after his discovery, went mad even by World Eater standards. As the planet's killing cold forced both World Eaters and Emperor's children to seek shelter, Khan set fire to both Legion's refuge points, forcing his brothers back out into the frozen night to fight or die. The World Eaters, never a cohesive force even at the best of times, shattered into countless warbands, each following its own path of slaughter across the galaxy. Angron himself seemed to care little about this fracturing. As a demon prince, his concerns were no longer organizational or strategic. He existed to kill, to bring glory to Khorne through the spilling of blood. Whether his sons fought together or separately made no difference as long as the killing continued. Yet he would manifest in real space at the head of various World Eaters' forces, lead them in devastating campaigns, and then vanish back into the warp when the bloodshed grew thin. During the 38th millennium, Angron led what would become known as the Dominion of Fire. At the head of 50,000 World Eaters berserkers, space marines so lost to the nails that they could barely be called human anymore, he carved a path of destruction through Imperial space that lasted over 2 centuries. 70 entire sectors were devastated, billions killed, entire civilizations exterminated. The rampage only ended when 4 Space Marine chapters, 2 Titan legions, and more than 30 Astra Militarum regiments combined forces to stop him. Even then, it took years of sustained combat to retake the lost territories and drive the World Eaters back. Yet this was the pattern of Angron's existence in the long millennia after the heresy. He would appear, usually leading a massive warband of World Eaters and cornate demons. He would descend upon Imperial worlds like a hurricane of violence, killing without discrimination or mercy. Defenders would die in their millions, cities would burn, and entire populations would be put to the sword. Eventually, the Imperium would muster enough force to drive him back or banish him to the warp, buying a reprieve until the next manifestation. The Imperium learned to watch for certain signs that presaged Angron's arrival. Warp storms would intensify in a region of space. Reports of increased violence and unnatural rage would come from multiple systems. Isolated worlds would go silent, their populations massacred before anyone could respond. And then the Red Angel himself would arrive, his fleet of damned ships translating from the warp, his armies descending upon worlds that had no chance of survival. For the common citizens of the Imperium, Angron became a nightmare figure, a demon from ancient myth whose name was spoken only in whispers. Parents would frighten disobedient children with tales of the Red Angel, who would come and drag them away if they misbehaved. Soldiers would pray that they would never face him in battle, knowing that those who did rarely survived to tell the tale. He had become exactly what the Elder had feared when they tried to kill him in those mountains on Nuceria so long ago, an unstoppable force of violence and destruction. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Angron's existence during these millennia was that he could not die. Death, all which had been denied to him on Deshelica Ridge when the Emperor stole him away, was still beyond his reach. As a demon prince, he was immortal in all the ways that mattered. He could be banished, yes, sent screaming back into the warp when enough psychic or physical force was brought to bear. But he would always return, reforming in the realm of chaos, building his strength until he could manifest once more. He was trapped in existence, bound to continue killing forever, unable to find the peaceful death he had once been willing to embrace alongside his brothers and sisters. There were those within the Imperium who studied him, trying to understand what he had become. Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus, the demon hunters, compiled extensive files on the Red Angel's manifestations, looking for patterns or weaknesses. Yet they noted that his rages seemed to follow certain cycles, that he appeared more frequently in regions where massive violence had already occurred, as if drawn by the psychic resonance of slaughter. They theorized about his connection to Horn, about whether he retained any vestige of his mortal personality, or had been completely consumed by his demonic nature. But for all their study, for all their accumulated knowledge, the Inquisition could not answer the fundamental question: was there anything left of the gladiator from Nuceria inside the demon prince? Did Angron, in whatever passed for consciousness in his transformed state, still remember his brothers and sisters from the Eaters of Cities? Did he still carry the rage of betrayal toward the Emperor, or had even that been subsumed into the mindless hunger that Khorne demanded? But the answer, if anyone knew it, was buried too deep to reach. The World Eaters who still served him, scattered across the Eye of Terror and the wider galaxy in their various warbands, had their own perspectives on their Primarch. Some revered him as the ultimate expression of Khorne's will, a being who had transcended mortality to become pure violence. Others, particularly the older warriors who had known him before his transformation, saw him as a tragic figure, a Primarch who had been failed by everyone who should have protected him. But whether they revered him or pitied him, they all followed him when he called, for they were World Eaters, and that was what they were made to do. The First War for Armageddon. In the year 444 M41, the Space Hulk Devourer of Stars emerged from the warp into the Armageddon system. Space Hulks are massive conglomerations of ships and debris that drift through the warp, growing larger as they accumulate more wreckage, powered by the strange physics of the Imperium rather than conventional drives. They are incredibly dangerous, often infested with genestealers, orcs, or worse things. But this particular Hulk was worse than most, for it carried within its twisted corridors an army of world eaters, cultists, demons, and at their head, Angron himself. The arrival was not entirely unexpected. Strange events had been occurring on Armageddon for months. Cultist uprisings, mysterious murders, psychic disturbances that made the planet's astropaths scream in their sleep. The seeds of invasion had been carefully planted, preparing the way for what was to come. Well, when the Devourer of Stars materialized in orbit and began vomiting forth drop pods and assault craft, Armageddon was already teetering on the edge of chaos. The initial assault fell upon Armageddon Prime, one of the planet's 3 major land masses. The World Eaters descended from the Hulk like a plague, bringing with them the full horror of 10,000 years of undying rage. Nearly half of the planetary defense force turned traitor, their minds corrupted by subtle influence over the preceding months. The remaining loyal forces found themselves fighting not just invaders but their own comrades, brother turning on brother, as the planet descended into civil war. Angron led from the front, a massive figure of crimson muscle and brass armor, his very presence seeming to drive men mad with bloodlust. Where he walked, reality itself weakened, allowing lesser demons to pour through tears in the fabric of space. His bodyguard, the Cruor Praetoria, consisted of 12 bloodthirsters, greater demons of Khorne, each one a towering monster of flame and fury. Together, they were a force that could shatter armies and crack fortress walls. The World Eaters, their numbers swollen with cultists and possessed humans, conducted a systematic slaughter. Entire hive cities were overrun, their billion-strong populations put to the sword. The bloodlust-driven traitor Space Marines descended upon Armageddon's people with gleeful abandon, the butcher's nails singing in their skulls as they killed and killed and killed. Within the first weeks, millions had died, their blood soaking into Armageddon's ash-covered soil, yet their skulls added to the pyramids that the World Eaters built to honor their patron god. But Armageddon was not without defenders. Logan Grimner, Great Wolf of the Space Wolves chapter and one of the Imperium's greatest living heroes, arrived with his great company. The Space Wolves, hardened veterans of countless wars, immediately began organizing the defense, rallying the scattered Imperial forces and establishing defensive lines. Grimner knew instantly what they faced. This was not merely a raid or a punitive strike. This was full-scale invasion led by a demon Primarch. And if Armageddon fell, the consequences would ripple across the entire sector. The Imperial forces fought with desperate courage, trading space for time, sacrificing thousands to slow the World Eaters' advance. But Angron was not in a hurry. While he paused his assault repeatedly to build monuments from the corpses of the slain, vast pyramids of flesh and bone that served as offerings to Khorne. These delays gave the defenders precious time to regroup, to fortify their positions, to call for reinforcements from across the sector. Grimnar made the call that would save Armageddon, but would also plant the seeds of future tragedy. He contacted the Grey Knights, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, the Inquisition's demon hunters. The Grey Knights were the Imperium's ultimate weapon against the denizens of the Warp. Space Marines selected not just for physical prowess, but for psychic ability and spiritual incorruptibility. Each Grey Knight was a warrior psyker, trained in secret on Titan, Saturn's moon, armed with force weapons that could banish demons with a single strike. If anyone could face a demon Primarch and survive, it would be them. 109 Grey Knights, all wearing Terminator armor and bearing the chapter's finest weapons, teleported directly into the heart of the World Eaters' assault. They appeared in the midst of Angron's army, their arrival announced by a flash of psychic energy that lit up the battlefield like a miniature sun. Their target was singular and clear: the demon Primarch himself. The Grey Knights engaged Angron and his bloodthirster bodyguards in what would become one of the most famous battles in their chapter's history. These were the Imperium's finest demon hunters, each one a veteran of decades or even centuries of war against the warp's denizens. They moved with coordinated precision, their force weapons blazing with psychic fire. Their minds joined in a battle meditation that allowed them to act as one entity with many bodies. But they were facing a demon Primarch at the height of his power, backed by 12 of Khorne's greatest champions. The initial exchange was catastrophic. Angron moved through the Grey Knights like a crimson storm, his blade, Samni Arius, and his axe Spinegrinder claiming lives with every swing. A single stroke of his black blade, a cursed weapon he had taken up after his transformation, cut through 5 Grey Knights in Terminator armor, their blessed ceramite offering no more protection than paper against the demon-forged steel. The bloodthirsters were equally devastating, each one a killing machine that towered over even the Grey Knights' augmented forms. They swung massive axes that burned with hellfire, their wings spreading darkness across the battlefield, their roars causing lesser mortals to flee in terror or collapse into madness. For a time, it seemed that the Grey Knights would be annihilated, that their sacrifice would be meaningless. But there was one among them whose name would be remembered: Hyperion, a young psyker whose latent power had never fully manifested until this moment. As Angron was about to strike down Hyperion's battle brother Malchadiel, the young Grey Knight acted on pure instinct. He reached out with his mind, channeling every ounce of psychic power he possessed, and caught Angron's black blade in mid-swing. The blade froze in the air, held by nothing but Hyperion's will. It was impossible, or should have been. A mortal psyker, even a Grey Knight, arms should not have been able to stop a demon Primarch's weapon through sheer psychic force. But Hyperion was no ordinary psyker, and in that moment of desperate need, his true power finally awakened. The black blade, held immobile by forces that Angron could not overcome, began to crack. Psychic lightning played across its surface, fractures spreading through the demon-forged metal. And then, with a sound like reality itself breaking, the blade shattered into 1,000 pieces. The destruction of his primary weapon gave the Grey Knights the opening they needed. They pressed their advantage, their coordinated assault driving back the bloodthirsters, their force weapons finding gaps in the demons' defenses. But it was Brother Captain Taramar Aurelian who achieved what they had come to do, or leading the surviving Grey Knights in a final assault, channeling their combined psychic might into a single focused attack. Aurelian banished Angron. The ritual was not a simple dismissal. It required Aurelian to speak the demon Primarch's true name, the word of power that defined Angron's essence in the warp. Speaking a demon's true name gave you power over it, but it was also incredibly dangerous. The name fought back, trying to corrupt the speaker, trying to turn the banishment back on the banisher. Aurelian held firm, his will unbreakable, his faith absolute. And as he spoke the final syllables of the ritual, Angron screamed, a sound of pure rage and frustration that echoed across Armageddon and into the warp beyond. The demon Primarch's physical form came apart, dissolving into crimson mist and screaming faces. And he was dragged back through the veil of reality, sent howling into the realm of chaos, banished for 100 years and a day according to the terms of the ritual. The bloodthirsters, their master gone, vanished as well, pulled back into the warp by the same force that had claimed Angron. The remaining World Eaters, suddenly finding themselves leaderless and without demonic support, were slaughtered by the converging Imperial forces. Brother Captain Aurelian did not survive to see the victory. The effort of banishing a demon Primarch, of speaking that true name and holding against the psychic backlash, had burned through his very soul. He died on the battlefield, his sacrifice ensuring that Armageddon would survive. Of the 109 Grey Knights who had teleported in to face Angron, only 13 survived. It was a casualty rate that would have broken any other unit, but the Grey Knights counted it as an acceptable price for victory. But the aftermath of the First War for Armageddon would prove nearly as dark as the war itself. The Inquisition, in its infinite wisdom and paranoia, decided that the knowledge of the demon Primarch's invasion could not be allowed to spread. The common people of Armageddon, the soldiers who had fought and died defending their world, the billions who had survived the World Eater's onslaught, all of them had been exposed to chaos. All of them now carried the taint of forbidden knowledge. The entire population of Armageddon was rounded up. Every single person who had fought on the planet's surface, except for the Space Marines, was sterilized to prevent them from passing on their corruption to future generations. They were then sent to work camps where they would spend the rest of their lives in enforced labor, never to see their homeworld again. Armageddon was repopulated with citizens from other systems, people who had no memory of what had occurred. This alone was a tragedy, but the Inquisition went further. Imperial Guard regiments that had fought on Armageddon were deemed compromised. As they departed the system, Grey Knight's strike cruisers destroyed their transports, killing hundreds of thousands of loyal soldiers simply because they had seen things the Inquisition wished to keep secret. 3 entire worlds in the Tremaine sector were exterminated, billions of people killed, to ensure that a single company of stormtroopers who had fought alongside the Grey Knights could never tell anyone what they had witnessed. Logan Grimnar, or the Great Wolf, was horrified and enraged when he learned the full extent of the Inquisition's actions. These were loyal servants of the Imperium, people who had fought and bled to save their world, and they were being killed or imprisoned simply for surviving. He protested vehemently, but the Inquisition was adamant. The knowledge of chaos had to be contained, no matter the cost. The conflict between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition would come to a head years later, in what became known as the Months of Shame, when inquisitorial forces and Grey Knights besieged Fenris itself in an attempt to force Grimnar to comply with their demands. But that is another story, one that speaks to the broader tragedy of the Imperium, that its defenders are sometimes as dangerous to its people as the enemies they fight against. As for Angron, he had been banished, but not destroyed. Somewhere in the depths of the warp, in the brass citadels of Khorne's realm, his essence reformed. The banishment had been for 100 years and a day, as the ritual dictated. He would be back. The galaxy would bleed again under his fury. It was only a matter of time. Return in the era Indomitus. For over 600 years after the First War for Armageddon, the Red Angel remained banished. His presence felt only as a distant threat whispered about in the Inquisition's darkest archives. The Imperium, beset by countless other wars and crises, almost allowed itself to believe that perhaps the demon Primarch would never return, that perhaps the Grey Knight's banishment had been more permanent than expected. But then came the opening of the Great Rift, that massive wound, in reality, that tore the galaxy in half. The birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum fundamentally changed the rules of existence. The barrier between the Materium and the Immaterium, already weakened by 10,000 years of constant warfare and psychic turmoil, finally gave way across vast swaths of space. Demon incursions that would have been once-in-a-century catastrophes became weekly occurrences. Entire star systems found themselves swallowed by warp storms, and those entities, who had been banished or imprisoned, found it suddenly much easier to return. Angron's re-emergence was heralded by a fleet of World Eater's warships, translating from the warp into real space, led by the ancient flagship Conqueror. The ship, corrupted and transformed by millennia in the Eye of Terror, was now more organic than mechanical. Its corridors pulsing with demonic life, its weapon systems powered by bound entities screaming in eternal torment. On the bridge of this nightmare vessel, Angron manifested, stepping through from the warp as easily as one might step through a doorway. His first act was characteristically violent. The Conqueror had been commanded in his absence by Kosalax the Forsworn, a powerful Chaos Lord who led a significant World Eater's warband. Kosalax had surrounded himself with 4 chief lieutenants, warlords who had carved their own paths of glory across the galaxy. Angron massacred them all within moments of his arrival, tearing them apart with his bare hands, their blood painting the bridge. Kosalax himself barely escaped, fleeing before his Primarch's wrath could be turned on him as well. Quote, the fleet's target was the world of Kalkin's Tribune, a heavily defended Imperial fortress world with a garrison of billions and a fleet of over 2,000 warships. It was precisely the kind of target that should have been impossible for any force to conquer. Heavily fortified, well supplied, defended by experienced troops, and supported by orbital defenses that could reduce entire continents to ash. But Angron led his force against it anyway, not because it was strategic or necessary, but because it was there and it could bleed. The assault on Kalkin's Tribune was apocalyptic. Angron himself led the initial assault, descending from orbit at the head of a massive demon army. Where he set foot, the Earth itself seemed to recoil, volcanic fissures opening, reality warping and tearing. His presence weakened the barrier between worlds so severely that demons poured through spontaneously, needing no ritual or summoning, simply manifesting wherever the killing was thickest. The defenders of Kalkin's Tribune fought with desperate courage. They held nothing back, committing their full military might to stopping the invasion. But against a demon Primarch and the full fury of the World Eaters, they might as well have been fighting a force of nature. In a matter of weeks, the entire world was a charnel house. The billion-strong garrison was annihilated. The fleet was shattered, its ships burning in orbit or captured and converted into twisted monuments to Khorne. Not a single human life remained on the planet by the time Angron was finished with it. But the Red Angel's hunger was not satisfied. From Kalkin's Tribune, and he led his fleet deeper into Imperial space, targeting world after world. Each conquest followed the same pattern: overwhelming assault, total slaughter, the taking of skulls for Khorne's throne. The Imperium, already stretched desperately thin by the opening of the Great Rift and countless other crises, struggled to respond effectively. The Grey Knights, remembering their success at Armageddon, began planning another banishment. Led by Epistolary Grouchus Telemain, a small strike force set out to stop Angron before he could reach his ultimate target. Malak Baal, an important Imperial world that housed something called the Choral Engine, a massive psychic device whose purpose was known only to the highest echelons of the Inquisition and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Grouchus and his Grey Knights used a captured psyker to create a psychic beacon as a false signal designed to lure Angron away from his planned path. They chose the world of Hyades as their battleground, preparing a trap that would hopefully banish the demon Primarch once again. The plan required the 13 Grey Knights to sacrifice themselves, using their combined psychic might to trigger a warp explosion that would consume Hyades and hopefully drag Angron back into the Imperium. Angron, driven by the hunger for violence that defined his existence, took the bait. His fleet descended on Hyades, and he led his forces in a massacre of the planet's population. But as the Grey Knights enacted their ritual, as they prepared to sacrifice both themselves and the entire world to stop him, something unexpected happened. The psychic explosion was triggered. A blast of warp energy so massive that it devoured Hyades completely, killing billions and ripping a temporary wound in reality. But Angron, at the last moment, pulled back, his demon nature allowing him to sense the trap even through the haze of battle lust. The wound closed, Hyades was gone, and much of Kosalax's fleet was destroyed. But Angron himself emerged only wounded, not banished. He retreated to the Conqueror to recover, his physical form regenerating from the damage the psychic explosion had caused. And there, the surviving Grey Knights made their final play. They boarded the flagship, fighting their way through corridors filled with demons and corrupted space marines, seeking to confront the demon Primarch directly. The battle on the Conqueror was desperate beyond measure. Grey Knights in their powered armor faced off against a being who could tear apart tanks with his bare hands. Grouchus himself piloted a Dreadknight, a massive exo-armor that gave him something approaching the size and strength to face Angron directly. They fought through the ship, each step contested by World Eaters and demons, until finally they reached the bridge where Angron waited. The duel that followed was over almost before it began. Angron tore through the Grey Knights with terrifying efficiency, his 10,000 years of existence having taught him every trick that demon hunters might use against him. Grautis, in his Dread Knight, managed to wound the demon Primarch, his force weapons burning Angron's demonic flesh. But it wasn't enough. Then Paladin Dvorak, one of the last surviving Grey Knights, did something that should have been impossible. He spoke Angron's true name, the same weapon that had been used to banish him at Armageddon. The word of power that defined his essence was turned against him once more. The name crashed over Angron like a psychic blow, momentarily stunning him, holding him immobile. But true names work both ways. Speaking them gives you power over the daemon, but it also connects you to that daemon, opening a channel through which corruption can flow. In that moment of connection, as Dvorak held Angron frozen with the power of the name, the daemon Primarch struck back. He couldn't move physically, but his presence, his essence, reached through that psychic connection and tried to corrupt the Grey Knight from within. Dvorak, his will like iron, held firm long enough for Grausis to land a devastating blow. But the exertion, the backlash from speaking the name, was too much. The force of Angron's resistance tore a hole in the hull of the Conqueror, and the void of space sucked out the remaining Grey Knights. Grausis, even as he was pulled out into the vacuum, managed one final act of defiance. He sent his soul deep into the warp, denying Angron the satisfaction of consuming it. The demon Primarch was left wounded, furious, and more determined than ever to reach his target. When Angron and his fleet finally arrived at Malak Bael, they found it defended by a significant force of Grey Knights and Imperial Guard. The defenders had been preparing for weeks, establishing defensive positions, bringing in reinforcements, setting up layers of fortifications designed specifically to slow a demon army. But the battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most savage of the era Indomitus. Angron proved that despite his demonic nature, despite 10,000 years as a creature of pure rage, he was still capable of strategy when it suited his purposes. He divided his forces into 3 pincers, coordinating their attacks with a tactical sophistication that caught the defenders off guard. This was not the mindless berserker that many had expected, but a being who could, when necessary, remember that he had once been a Primarch, a general created to lead armies in conquest. The Grey Knights threw everything they had at stopping him. 60 of their finest warriors, backed by Tempestus Scions, the Astra Militarum's elite special forces, made their stand at the Choral Engine itself. They knew that if Angron reached the device, if he destroyed or corrupted it, the consequences would ripple across the entire sector. But 60 Grey Knights, even supported by mortal soldiers, even using tactics refined over 10,000 years of demon fighting, were not enough. Angron came at them like a crimson storm, his 8 bloodthirster honor guards clearing a path through the defenders. The Grey Knights fought with desperate courage, their force weapons blazing, their combined psychic might turned against the demon prince. They wounded him grievously, each strike burning demonic essence, forcing him to expend power to regenerate. But they could not kill him, and they could not banish him. One by one, they fell, until the last Grey Knight died with his fingers wrapped around his force weapon, having drawn one final drop of demon blood before his strength failed him. Angron stood alone before the Choral Engine, his body covered in wounds, leaking ichor that hissed and steamed on the ground. For a moment, just a moment, it seemed he might be too weakened to continue. Then Khorne himself intervened. The Blood God, watching from his brass throne in the realm of chaos, recognized an opportunity. Through Angron, his champion and avatar, Khorne could reach out and touch the Imperium directly. The demon Primarch became a conduit for his patron's power, his already massive form swelling further, energy crackling around him. When Angron struck the Choral Engine, it was not with his strength alone, but with the might of a chaos god channeled through him. The engine shattered, but rather than simply being destroyed, it released a psychic shockwave known as the Murder Curse, or the wave spread out from Malak Bael at faster-than-light speeds, passing through real space and the warp simultaneously. It touched nearly every ship in Indomitus Crusade Fleet Quartus, one of the massive Imperial fleets that had been assembled to reconquer the dark side of the Great Rift. The curse corrupted them, turned them against each other, forced loyal Imperial forces to fight their brothers as their minds were twisted by Khaonate influence. The scale of the disaster was catastrophic. An entire Crusade fleet, thousands of ships carrying hundreds of thousands of Space Marines and millions of Imperial Guard soldiers, was essentially neutralized in a single moment. Some ships would be recovered eventually, their crews deprogrammed or executed and replaced. But many were lost forever, and either destroyed in the ensuing battles or fled into the warp, their crews now servants of the Blood God. Angron had achieved what few demon Primarchs could claim. He had struck a blow against the Imperium so severe that its effects would be felt for centuries. It wasn't just the lives lost or the ships corrupted. It was the strategic damage, the loss of momentum in the Indomitus Crusade, the breathing room given to Chaos forces across an entire sector. From Khorne's perspective, it was a magnificent gift of skulls and blood. But even this victory could not satisfy the hunger that drove Angron. The demon Primarch retreated back to the Conqueror, his wounds slowly healing, his mind already turning toward the next target. There would be other worlds to conquer, other populations to slaughter, other battles to fight. The cycle would continue, as it had for 10,000 years, as it would for 10,000 more. Legacy of the Red Angel. When we look back across the tragic saga of Angron's existence, from the boy Primarch crashing into Nuceria's mountains to the demon prince laying waste to Imperial worlds in the 41st millennium, we see perhaps the saddest story in all of Warhammer's grim darkness. Other Primarchs fell to chaos through pride, ambition, or corruption. Magnus broke his father's greatest work through arrogance. Horus was manipulated through ego. Fulgrim was seduced by pleasure. But Angron was pushed. Every step of his fall was forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control, by decisions made by others, so by a cascade of betrayals and violations that left him with no choice but to become the monster everyone seemed determined to make him. Consider what he might have been. The Emperor created him with a purpose, imbued him with gifts and capabilities meant to serve the Great Crusade. In another timeline, one where he landed on a different world or was found before the High Riders could enslave him, Angron might have been the Imperium's greatest champion of the oppressed. His natural empathy, glimpsed briefly in his relationship with his fellow gladiators, could have made him a Primarch who truly understood what it meant to fight for humanity rather than simply conquering in its name. Instead, the Butcher's nails destroyed that potential before it could develop. They didn't just make him violent, they robbed him of the capacity for joy, or for peace, for any emotion except rage. Imagine living every moment of your existence in pain, knowing that the only relief comes from killing, and even that relief is temporary, lasting only seconds before the agony returns. This was Angron's reality from the moment the surgery was completed. Every breath was torture, every moment of existence a battle against the implants eating away at his brain. The World Eaters' Legion, shaped in their Primarch's image, became a monument to this tragedy. Before Angron was found, the Warhounds were known for their discipline and aggressive tactics, but they were still a functional legion capable of coordinating with other Imperial forces. After Angron, after the nails spread through their ranks, they became something else entirely. A force of nature that could be pointed at an enemy but never truly controlled. Warriors so consumed by the need for violence that they would kill their own brothers when no other targets remained. The Legion's cultural practices, adopted from Nuceria, tell their own tragic story. The gladiatorial combats, the decimation when they failed to meet Angron's arbitrary time limits, the refusal to use ranged weapons in favor of chainswords and axes. All of these were symptoms of a legion trying to connect with a Primarch who could barely connect with himself. They inflicted his suffering upon themselves, not because he demanded it, but because they hoped that by sharing his pain, they might finally earn his approval, or at least his acknowledgement. Harn the Betrayer, whose name has become synonymous with Khaonate violence across the galaxy, exemplifies the World Eater's tragedy. He was the warrior who first reached out to Angron, who somehow saw past the rage to the person beneath. He served his Primarch faithfully through the Great Crusade and the heresy, and yet, by the time of Scalathrax, he had been so degraded by the nails and by exposure to chaos that he turned on his own legion, setting fire to their refuge and forcing them to fight or freeze. The man who tried to help his gene father became the instrument of the legion's final dissolution. The transformation into a demon prince, often portrayed as Lorgar's great gift to his brother, can be seen as the final theft of Angron's agency. Throughout his life, from slavery on Nuceria to service to the Emperor to fighting for Horus, Angron never had a choice about his destiny. And then, at Nuceria, even the choice to die was stolen from him. Lorgar, believing he was saving his brother, instead condemned him to an existence even worse than the one he'd known. As a mortal, Angron at least could have hoped for death. As a demon prince, even that escape is denied to him forever. The Inquisition's actions after the First War for Armageddon reveal how the Imperium itself fails to learn from Angron's tragedy. Just as the Emperor chose to steal Angron away rather than help him save his brothers and sisters, the Inquisition chose to massacre loyal defenders rather than acknowledge that chaos exists and can be fought. The survivors of Armageddon, who had stood against a demon Primarch and lived, were punished for their survival. Yet their sacrifice turned into a crime that required a life sentence in work camps or outright execution. Logan Grimnar's response, his refusal to accept this injustice, shows that some within the Imperium understood what Angron himself had known on Deshalika Ridge, that some things are worth more than survival, that humanity, lowercase, is more important than the Imperium, uppercase. But Grimnar was overruled, his protest dismissed, because the Imperium has learned the wrong lessons from 10,000 years of warfare. It has learned to hide the truth rather than face it, to eliminate witnesses rather than prepare for future threats. In the current timeline, with the Great Rift torn open and the galaxy more dangerous than ever, Angron continues his endless campaign of slaughter. He cannot be reasoned with, cannot be negotiated with, cannot be redeemed. The person who once fed his own blood to his comrades to keep them alive a little longer is gone, buried so deep beneath demon and rage that even the most powerful psykers cannot reach whatever remains. All that's left is a weapon wielded by Horn, an avatar of violence that exists solely to spill blood and take skulls. But even recognizing this, even understanding that the man is truly gone, we cannot help but see the tragedy. Every world Angron burns, every billion lives he ends, every skull added to Khorne's throne, all of it traces back to decisions made by others. The High Riders who enslaved him, the surgeons who hammered the nails into his skull, the Emperor who stole him rather than save him, Lorgar who transformed him rather than let him die. Each one believed they were doing what was necessary, knew what was right, what was practical, and each one pushed him further down a path he never chose to walk. This is what makes Angron the most tragic figure in Warhammer's vast mythology. He is simultaneously the most brutal Primarch and the most pitiable. He has killed more than perhaps any other, except Horus, left a trail of corpses that stretches across the galaxy and back again. But unlike the other traitor Primarchs, he never wanted this. He would have died with his brothers and sisters on Deshalika Ridge and counted it a good death. Instead, he was forced to live, forced to serve, forced to kill, forced to become a demon, denied every choice that might have let him be anything other than what he became. The Imperium often speaks of the Emperor's great works, and was the Primarchs who were meant to unite humanity and conquer the galaxy in mankind's name. They are venerated as heroes, their gene seed carefully preserved, their legions and successor chapters continuing their missions 10,000 years after the heresy. But Angron's story asks uncomfortable questions about that project. What does it say about the Emperor's vision that one of his sons was broken beyond repair before he even found him. What does it say about the Imperium that they created Space Marines in Angron's image despite knowing the damage the nails had done? If there is a lesson to be learned from the Red Angel's saga, it is perhaps this: that sometimes the greatest cruelties are inflicted not by those who hate us, but by those who believe they are helping, or who make choices on our behalf without considering what we would choose for ourselves. The High Riders who performed the nail surgery thought they were making a better gladiator. The Emperor who took Angron from Deshelica Ridge thought he was saving his son. Lorgar, who transformed Angron into a demon, thought he was freeing his brother from pain. Each one was catastrophically wrong, but none of them ever asked what Angron wanted. In the end, Angron's legacy is one of warning as much as tragedy. He stands as testament to what happens when empathy fails, when practicality overrides compassion, when the ends are allowed to justify any means. He is the brutalized becoming the brutalizer, the slave who could never be free, the weapon that was once a person. And he will continue to rage across the galaxy until the heat death of the universe itself, or until some power finally grants him the peaceful death that was stolen from him so long ago. The galaxy burns under his fury, but the truly tragic thing is that it never had to be this way. Somewhere in the mountains of Nuceria, in the moments after the Eldar attack, a wounded child needed help. He needed healing, protection, guidance. Instead, he got chains, and from those chains came the Red Angel, and from the Red Angel came rivers of blood that will never run dry. This has been the complete story of Angron, from the crashed infant to the demon prince, from the gladiator slave to the breaker of armies, from the betrayed to the betrayer. He is the most brutal Primarch in Warhammer 40,000, a being whose capacity for violence has rarely been matched in all the galaxy's bloody history. But he is also a victim, one who has suffered more perhaps than any other Primarch, who was given every reason to hate and rage and kill, and who became exactly what everyone seemed determined to make him become. If you found this deep dive into one of Warhammer's most tragic figures illuminating, if it helped you understand just how the gladiator from Nuceria became the Red Angel, then please consider leaving a like on this video. It helps the channel tremendously and tells YouTube that this is the kind of in-depth lore content that people want to see. And if you want more explorations of Warhammer 40,000's darkest stories, if you want to journey through the grim darkness of the far future and understand the figures who shaped it, then subscribe to Q on 40,000. We're building a community of lore enthusiasts who appreciate the depth and tragedy that makes this universe so compelling, and we'd love to have you join us. The Emperor protects. But sometimes, as Angron learned too late, protection is not the same as salvation. Thank you for watching, and may you never know the curse of chains that can never be broken.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.